So, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone listening and joining in today's talk. My name is Dzaeman Dzulkifli, the Director of Tropical Rainforest Conservation and Research Center. In today's talk, I'll be talking about how we at TRCRC are maintaining functional forests among a sea of dominated landscapes. So what you see right here is typically one of the best representatives of natural forests we have in Malaysia. This picture was taken in Borneo. It consists of a very varied canopy. You get many different sort of species. Up to 200 species of trees exist within a single hectare of forest in the entire in Malaysia, Borneo. But what we actually look at closely as an ecologist are mostly the functionalities of these trees. So there's an image right here showcase that we can look at the landscape in pixels or a mosaic, such as the topic of today's kind of theme. So in this mosaic of forest, what you have is actually different functions. Different trees play different roles. We have canopy emergence, which are typically the timber species that we get here in the tropics. We have fruit trees marked in yellow, representing food production for some of the wildlife, and we've got different understory species emerging up against the canopy. Typically, our forest is dominated by a single species of canopy tree called the TRCRC, which you see emerging right here. They can grow up for up to 40 meters in height, and the tallest was recently discovered in Danum Valley, Sabah, Borneo, to be about 100.8 meters high. Just 13 meters of the short of a sequoia, which is close to about 113 meters high. These trees are very interesting in terms of their reproductive biology. Over here you see them captured by drone images of them flowering in the forest. They fruit and flower every 5 to 7 years. So relatively long reproductive cycle. Typically they are triggered by prolonged drought for about 3 months or so. When the forest dries out, it triggers these trees to all mass fruit and flower at the same time. So it's a very spectacular moment, and this gives us a very small window of opportunity to collect and use these trees for restoration initiatives. Now, this family of trees come from a family called the TRCRC, which in Latin stands for di, meaning two, taro meaning wing, carp meaning seed. So TRCRC is typical of them. The seeds are quite varied in sizes. They can have up to about a couple of millimeters in size, all the way up to about as long as your forearm. So they're very interesting morphologically. They do not fly so well, and so when they kind of distribute themselves, they're kind of going through probably about 30 meters or so in distance. They're very interesting. Now focus in them actually. A, they regenerate very slowly. B, they do not have any sort of seed banks. So when they fall into the forest floor, they have to germinate and sit down in the forest floor as a seedling. And almost at all times, most of them are recalcitrant, meaning you cannot conserve them within a cryopreserved kind of system. So what has to be done is you have to regenerate and restore the forest in current time, so that these trees can coexist within different landscapes. So in the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation, a lot of them are kind of listed on the IUCN. In Malaysia, we have one which is extinct already, but still present in Indonesia, and they're extremely vulnerable. They're very subjective to kind of fragmentation. So when forest becomes fragmented into smaller and smaller patches, what actually happens is these trees become vulnerable in terms of their capabilities of reproduction. They're unable to reproduce, and so depending on the forest size, you're actually halting the way that forest can actually regenerate. So our mission at TRCRC is actually quite straightforward. What we're here is to halt the extinction of some of these species. How do we then safeguard forests and extend the forest range in terms of connectivity and functionality? And we work in 2 areas, predominantly in Sabah, Borneo, and in Peninsular Malaysia in Perak. all the way close up to the Thai border. And our mission is actually, how do we then retain these living collections, trees with high genetic value, high conservation value within A and XC2 kind of collection, which we manage up in these two states, and how do we reintroduce them back into the wild, into the landscape, which is varied in different sort of regions and capabilities. So at all times, what we're doing is we're capturing a genetic representative of the wild. So not only are we focusing on a single individual or single tree, what we want to do is we want to capture that variety of within species genetic diversity. So when we collect, we're collecting all this information about these trees, making sure that they are able to capture and able to stand alone if anything happened to the wild population. So this needs to be as varied as possible. So we have protocols ensuring that these trees are captured in the most way. We're mapping them out. When we are replanting them, we're thinking about the diversity and the distribution of these species. What we want to do is basically be removing them too far away from their origin or their center of kind of distribution. What we need to do is kind of maintain them within this area. So in our nurseries, in our project sites, the number one thing is actually starting with the nursery. In order to get any planting material, we need to make sure we're capturing the variety and the diversity of these forests. As I said, these forests can be up to 200 species of trees per hectare, ranging up to maybe sometimes a higher amount depending on the different types of terrain. And so in order to capture this, the nursery is one of the most important parts of the process. Each different tree will have its own unique kind of method in terms of horticulturally, how do you manage it in a nursery, and also how do we collect them from the wild. Each tree will have its own timing, so not all trees fruit and flower at the same time. So we need to capture that. And so what we're doing in both Sabah and in Peninsular Malaysia is actually capturing the variety of species, variety of genetic variety, and in order to then recreate forests as diverse and as natural as possible. But we also try to fit into the general goals of the initiatives. So in Peninsular Malaysia, we have a Central Forest Pine Initiative, which mirrors the Tiger Initiative, Tiger Action Plan, National Plan, which looks into kind of connecting forests together. So how can we use our high-value trees, our high-value forests and restoration material in order to restore corridors which have been degraded and which have been basically converted in some cases. So what we do is basically work on varied landscapes. There's two types of landscapes. There's the primary linkage, which is basically one forest linking to another forest, and then there is the secondary linkage where it's within a mixed and modified landscape. Within one forest to another forest is quite straightforward. So as you can see over here, this is our site in Perak, which is in PL2. It's basically linking the north of the Belum Rainforest to the south, the MENGO Forest Reserve. And what we need to do is actually connect these two forests by reintroducing some of the structure to this forest, and also introducing the different variety of fruit trees and canopy species that have gone missing in some of these forests since it's been gazetted. And as always, basically it starts in the nursery. And our team, up to 5 years right now, we've been collecting mostly and growing these trees to be able to then plant them. And that's the most important part, making sure that we have the correct seedlings and trees in place. Collecting them and making sure that we can have a varied and diverse seed collection is one of the most important parts. And it can take up to 5 to 7 years until we even get some seeds from some species. And also then to replant them will take another 2 years. So you're talking close to 9 to 10 years before any of these trees are even planted. So we spend a lot of time developing the nursery capacity. Now when these trees grow down, actually what we're working towards is how do we then reintroduce them into areas which have been prioritized for connectivity. Over here you see a viaduct that has been created for the wildlife crossing as part of the National Central Forest Pine Initiative, and some of these areas require restoration, and so what we do is we then reintroduce some of these species into the area, both closing up the canopy, ensuring that the area is safe for large mammals and predators to cut across, and also to ensure that you are protecting the different species of trees that we're planting within them as well. So this site right here is actually quite interesting. Large mammals have been using it. We have small cats as well using it as well, which is great. Predominantly the elephants will cross the road wherever possible, so they are quite safeguarded by some of these infrastructures on roads which cut across forests. But actually the smaller mammals which are very vulnerable to being roadkill, which we need to kind of focus on. And we also, in this area, it's very interesting. What happens is we have a range of communities within this area, and what we do is how do we then engage communities to be part of this picture. So we have an initiative with the State Park of Perak in the Belum Rainforest Reserve, where we're actually training in indigenous groups, the Jahai community, Orang Asli, the indigenous community that is present in the area. And what we're doing is we are training them to be able to identify key species that we can use for restoration, and not only identify them, but how do we then monitor them, mark and then collect them, and then grow them in nurseries. So we're setting up nurseries in the forest, where in their villages, right, exactly where the seed source is, and we're developing a way of then buying the seedlings from the communities to be used for our restoration project. And looking at the PL2 up in Perak, we've done quite a bit of work along the Central Forest Spine initiative funded by Yayasan Hazana. This project basically looks into all the level of degradedness and the opportunities that we can look forward to in terms of restoration. So there's many opportunities within a certain linkage. Levels of degradedness vary. Sometimes some options are not feasible as we go on the ground and ground truth some of these programs. Some of the areas are really not feasible anymore because they're community land that are converted into agriculture, for example. So we do not do work there. Now moving along to Sabah. Our Sabah project started in 2012, and there we're focusing on lowland species. We have close to about 200 hectares over there in Mersuli, which is about an hour away from the famous Danum Valley. And this area right here consists of a degraded land which was currently converted into palm oil, but right now we are regenerating back from abandoned palm oil into rainforest. So we're starting from scratch. What happens after 10 to 15 years is you get a nursing canopy of pioneer trees, but are very reduced in diversity. So from probably 200 different species per hectare, we're looking at maybe 10 to 20 species per hectare in this area. So this then gives us an opportunity to then start building up future seed orchards that we can use for future projects. So these trees within 10 to 15 years are then able to fruit and flower. So right now when we collect these trees from all around Borneo, all around Sabah, what we do is then have them located within these plots that we're designing. So each plot that is designed right here basically holds some of the genetic variety of the species that we collect from each different forest reserve. And so once those trees start to be mature, within 10 to 15 years, they will start producing fruit. Those trees will have a specific genetic signature that then can be used to restore areas where those trees were originally from. So we're thinking very far ahead of time, ensuring that we have resources and abundance of resources that we can use to restore these degraded lands. So how do we then, we also always start with the nursery, and this project has been going on and we've carried out successfully restoration of some of these trees within our plots. But this is within the living collections. How do we then work beyond landscapes? And going back to the map, focusing on the Central Forest Spine, what we see is actually the red areas, which are the areas that are a little bit more complicated. There's a little bit more more activity going on there, but crucial still for being stepping stones for wildlife. As I mentioned up in the first few slides, we can look at the forest as being pixelated, as having different functional roles. Within a landscape, we also kind of design our landscape to be able to function with these functional roles. So how can these little spots of forest can be identified? How we need to basically work with the different partners on the ground. We need to identify where the lowest hanging fruits. We have a lot of abandoned areas here, as you can see. Some are deserted and some are grasslands that we can then use to restore if there's no function for agriculture, for example. But majority of this landscape is actually dominated with palm. So how do we work within a landscape which is already dominated? Now, palm oil is pretty much is here to stay. It's within the Malaysian landscape. What needs to be done is further collaborations with the palm oil industry in order to be able to kind of create functional systems within the palm landscape. So it's important that we are engaging with these large landowners and land banks, and developing conservation initiatives that can have a win-win situation. A lot of palm oil players are signed up to the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, which requires them to restore and manage the high conservation areas. And so an NGO like TRCRC, we come aboard and develop initiatives with and alongside palm oil plantations in order to have the win-win situation. A lot of times the steep areas are too steep to be planted, and each river will require a buffer zone. And so within our plans, we kind of see how can these buffer zones link one forest to another forest. How can this river be a corridor, and how can we then increase the diversity and functionality of this forest? So a lot of times they will be degraded forests. These forests a lot of times will require some additionality, such as fruit trees. So this goes beyond, and we can work with also mining industries and so on. But within the urban landscape, we've recently been working in the Selangor region and looking at how within an urban landscape we can also create stepping stones and corridors. Each and every one of you might probably have a small patch of greenery, a small park within the township or within the area that you live in. And so from that potential areas, we can actually design it in such a way that they can be functional to the biodiversity and to our native flora and fauna. So it's all about looking at what is there. It's all about kind of mimicking how a landscape can function, and also how we can also work with different levels of planning. You know, we can work with the town and planning unit, we can work with local municipal councils, we can work with private landed properties, and so we can work with basically anyone who has green spaces out there in urban areas to connect some of these areas and become more functional in terms for stepping stones for biodiversity and wildlife. So with that said, TRCRC is ever looking for solutions. We are an organization which looks for how do we kind of get solutions off the paper, off the planning stage and into implementation. So we're very much interested to kind of develop a lot of this initiative, and a lot of times this program ticks off a lot of goals. We work towards a range of sustainable development goals in order to achieve a very simple mission, which is basically restoring biodiversity in Malaysia. So with that said, I would like to thank you guys for listening. Do look us up at trcrc.org. Thank you very much.